integrated in academic subjects which have been normally taught at schools. However, and this is the difference between Peters and Dewey here, unlike Peters, Dewey does not think that disciplinary canons should have priority over personal experiences and individual life worlds of the students. Quite in the contrary, Dewey insists that academic disciplines should be psychoized, that is, they should be decanonized and reconstructed in the way that these disciplines can be made compatible with the personal experiences of the students in order to serve as extensions, systematizations, and universalizations of those experiences. So the point of dealing with academic disciplines is to enlarge the personal experience, to systemize the personal experience of the students, and to universalize this experience, and not again to serve as a kind of societal self or cultural self-reproduction of the society. Also, Israel Scheffler makes a strict distinction between growing of rationality, and this is for him the kernel of education on one hand, and holding on disciplinary canons on the other. According to Scheffler, rationality is the ability to grasp principles, rules, and purposes, and to evaluate all those things critically in the light of reasons that might be put forward in public discussion. So the focus is here again on public reasoning, on public discussion. This notion of rationality comes so far very close to Peters' understanding of education as development of a cognitive perspective, of an attitude of grasping of conceptual schemes and principles of the facts, and of asking for their reasons. But again, unlike Peters, Scheffler claims that rationality goes far beyond academic mastery of factual subject matters. For him, cultivation of rationality is a matter of initiation into open rational discussion and not into academic disciplinary canons. Moreover, he sees a great merit in Dewey's emphasizing of the free judgment of the child as against fixed adult curricula imposed from above. Now, Peters' equalization of the initiation into public reason with the initiation into canons of academic disciplines is indeed not convincing. To be sure, dealing with concepts elaborated in the domains of academic disciplines like math, history, philosophy, art, etc., this dealing has a great deal for the cultivation of one's ability to participate in public reasoning. These concepts have a coherent structure, being components of systematic chains of argumentation with explicit and justifiable premises, so that they can claim a trans-individual and interprospectival validity. Claiming trans-individual and interprospectival validity is a main feature of public discourses or public reasoning. This makes them capable to serve as central tools of public reasoning, for public reasoning requires the participants to aim at mutual understanding that overlaps their particular perspectives, worldviews, or cultural values. However, the practice of public reasoning cannot and should not be understood as a sum of the disciplinary discourses of various sciences and arts like math, philosophy, history, etc. Subjects of public reasoning, issues of public reasonings are normally moral, political, and social issues that cross-cut disciplinary boundaries and that are rooted in the personal experiences of the participants and the discourses on these issues. So such issues are, for example, questions like, for example, it is just to have private schools, which kind of art is a good one and should be subsidized by the state, what is the relevance of my professional choice for the society, and which rewards should I expect and why for the job which I'm going to choose. And the claim is here that this type of questions should be put forward in the middle of educative pedagogical action of educative teaching, and not the initiation again in academic canons. Thus, in order to become fluent in public practical reasoning, the student does not need to internalize the academic canons and various disciplines as they have been developed by generations of professional scientists and scholars in the particular fields of knowledge. Rather, she, the student, should become capable in conceptual and argumentative articulation of facts and experiences by dealing with examples from different ways of thinking and seeing the world, like science, art, literature, and by applying those examples to the interests and the worldviews of one's own. I think that these differences between education and transmission of disciplinary canons are quite obvious and even trivial. So the question arises why such a brilliant philosopher of education like Peters did neglect those differences by identifying education as practice of becoming fluent of public reasoning with initiation into the canons of academic disciplines. How we can explain this failure, this mistake? It seems to me that the answer to that question lies in Peters' confusing education with teaching. His talk about education is almost always in the same time a talk about the transmission of contents of knowledge at schools. This talk is usually dedicated to a defense of personal independent bodies of knowledge that are structured in objective ways in the different academic domains, a defense against the progressive notion of child-centered teaching, child-centered pedagogy. Peters obviously sees this notion, the notion of child-centered pedagogy, as a treat for the cognitive dimension of education, understood as ability to identify and understand contents that are objectively valuable and to order these concepts in conceptual schemes. However, one can put the question whether teachers really have only the option, only the choice between first a child-centered pedagogy, second a conservative teaching of academic disciplines for their own sake, or third a balance, a so-called balance between the both. Could not be the case that the greatest educational effect can be achieved by teaching a selection of themes and concepts drawn from different disciplines and treated independently from the academic canons of these disciplines. If this is a possible alternative, however, then the following subsequent questions arise. Under which criteria this selection should be made, and how the term educational effect should be defined. In order to answer these questions, and in order to answer also the general question about the educational purpose and mechanisms of teaching, we have to disconnect the concept of education from the concept of teaching, and to put the former concept of education on a deeper level than the concept of teaching. In order to determine kinds of teaching, to identify kinds of teaching that are educative, we have first to answer the question again, what is education in itself and for itself? And this is my last part, education as Bildung, and that is why here I'm introducing the concept of Bildung. Now, up to now, we have seen that there is a large consensus between three most important philosophers in the Anglo-Saxon philosophy of education, Dewey, Peters, and Scheffler, that the term education indicates a particular form of human development, a form that leads to a deep ability to participate actually or virtually and to participate in discourses of public reasoning. The great merit, especially of Peters' work, is that he builds up a strong and systematic argument that this form of human development regards a disciplined dealing with objective, conceptually structured entities that transcend the sphere of immediately given personal experience. The weakness of Peters' theory is, however, that he only identifies this educative confrontation with transpersonal objects with the teaching of disciplinary canonized bodies of knowledges as they are represented in the various academic subjects and disciplines that traditionally have been taught at schools. In order to avoid this fallacy, we need to make a strict distinction between education and teaching, preserving at the same time the notion of education as a form of human development which presupposes individuals encountering with a conceptually structured objectivity. The question is, what is that thing, conceptually structured objectivity? This distinction and this notion are central to the concept of Bildung, as this concept has been developed in the framework of the German idealism. Unlike the English term education, Bildung is clearly distinct from the terms teaching and pedagogical action. So the concept of Bildung was developed outside and before even the emergence of educational science or pedagogy as different disciplines. In the same time, Bildung shares most of the central semantic features of education's human development towards public reasoning elaborated by Dewey, Peters, and Scheffler. That is why I shall now briefly sketch out the concept of Bildung as it has been developed mostly by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. So, according to Hegel, at Hegel we can discriminate between Bildung in a broader and Bildung in the narrow sense of the word. I'm here just briefly dealing with the Bildung in the narrow sense of the word. Bildung in the narrow sense denotes a particular stage in the development of the so-called absolute spirit. This is the stage where the subjective spirit, subjective mind if you want, does not interact anymore with fragmented things or nor with single persons, but with the so-called immediately given generality of a system of beliefs and norms of a particular community. That is what this system is called by Hegel as Sittlichkeit. These beliefs and norms occur now as ideal and yet external entities. So this is the notion of a external objectivity and yet ideal objectivity. The process of Bildung consists in overcoming the perception of these collective cultural beliefs and norms as unquestionable truths. At that stage, the subjective spirit recognizes these collective beliefs and norms, these collective worldviews, as expressions of the objective spirit in its development, and that implies that the subjective spirit here negates the immediateness and the externality of those collective beliefs and norms, of collective worldviews. That is to say, that the subject, the learning person, now understands collective ethical beliefs and norms as concepts, as objective concepts. The subject's interaction with those concepts is her being for herself That is the precondition for her being in herself, being as a subject who has a concept of herself as a subject, that is a somebody who is capable of understanding, of justifying, and of criticizing collective beliefs and norms. That is to say, to somebody who is able to grasp the conceptual structure of ethical, of collective beliefs, norms, and worldviews. The crucial question is here, what does it mean to deal with concepts? And what does it mean to conceptualize external ideal entities? Roughly speaking, it does mean first to group these entities on the ground of identical features, and second, to discriminate between general features that build up different concepts. This grouping and discriminating means to assert inferences between entities, inferences which are true, that is, which have objective validity that comes into being in correct judgments. Now, what I'm referring to here is, of course, an analytical or a new analytical version of Hegel, and this new analytical version has been developed during the last 20 years, perhaps, by the so-called Pittsburgh School. So I'm actually referring here to authors like basically Robert Brandon and also John McDowell. Judgments are correct only if they can be justified by arguments that are acceptable by every reasonable being. That is to say that true judgments display inferences between conceptual contents that constitute a universal logical space which transcends every particular environment, every particular social and cultural context. That is why we could use this universal logical space as just as another name for the classic term world. To sum up, to be an educated person means, with regard to Hegel, the ability to participate in the universal logical space of the world, a space that consists of concepts and of inferences between concepts, that is, of arguments. Arguments can be understood as inferences between concepts. This participation does not require an internalization of the canons of existing academic disciplines. Rather, to inhabit this space of reasons, means basically to transform one's own beliefs to conceptual contents and to assess the validity of these beliefs by articulating them in argumentative discourses. This implies the ability, ultimately, of playing the social game of giving and asking for reasons. This is a term, or this is a proposition, a claim developed by Robert Brandon. Now, I'm going to conclude now. So I have argued so far that in order to identify those kinds of pedagogical action that are educative ones and to discriminate them for those forms of pedagogical action which are not educative ones, we need first to draw a clear distinction between the terms education and teaching. We can achieve this distinction at best by spelling out education in Hegelian terms, that is, by reconstructing education as Bildung. A process of Bildung is to be understood basically as the development of one's ability of conceptual self-articulation by one's participation at practices of public reasoning, at the game of giving and asking for reasons. The first obvious prerequisite to become a fluent player of that game of giving and asking to reasons is to gain access to it, to be included in it. Although this seems to be quite a trivial claim, that access is often enough denied to children and young people all around the world. This is, for example, the case when schooling takes the form of indoctrination. In that case, the students are obviously not encouraged to ask for reasons for the assertions that the textbooks entail and for the doctrines which the students have to internalize, nor are they encouraged to examine the validity and the justifications of those assertions and doctrines. Furthermore, we should be aware that playing the game of giving and asking for reasons is basically an activity of conceptual articulation of one's own beliefs, everyday beliefs and notions. Before their conceptual articulation, these beliefs and notions exist merely as intuitions that mirror the social experience of the individual as well as her desires and fears. So the first and foremost prerequisite of the student's process of Bildung is the empathic acknowledgement of her preconceptual and precognitive beliefs and notions and of her desires and fears that stand behind them. These beliefs and notions should be brought to expression in the classroom, and this expression should be seen as the departing point of teaching and learning. A further form of intersubjective recognition apart from empathy is needed for the process of Bildung, namely the form of respect. This form is needed for the cognitive jump from the only narrative expression of one's own beliefs and opinions to their conceptual articulation. For respect means, to speak with Peters again, to regard a person as a distinctive center of consciousness, as someone who is capable, someone who has his own assertive point of view and who is capable of evaluation, choice, and judgment. To be capable of judgment implies to reflect upon one's own beliefs and notions, to evaluate them critically, to provide them with reasons. Thus, to respect someone means to recognize her as having the potential of reasoning. So the moral of the whole story I try to tell in this paper is that empathy and cognitive respect for the students, and not the reproduction and the transmission of the canons of academic disciplines, should be identified as leading norms of educative teaching. These norms are not incorporated in an anti-intellectual, child-centered pedagogy, but rather in a Socratic mode of teaching and learning. I thank you very much for your patience.
To make your questions as brief as you can, given the time constraints we have. Yes, please, gentlemen here.
First of all, I want to congratulate you for the excellent detailed analysis. I have taken one particular point which you said, particular form of human development. That aspect I want to touch. I think all over the world, many educationists are exactly doing that today, to develop a particular form of human development. Let me take the story of two great democracies. One says we are the greatest democracy in the world. The other says we are the largest democracy in the world. What are they doing actually? They are doing the maximum injustice to their own children. You know what is happening in American schools nowadays. Children going to the schools, taking guns and killing children, and starting with their mother, his own mother. So that democracy says we have to teach democracy to the rest of the world. And the larger democracy here in India, just 2 days ago, somebody has discovered a new god for mosquitoes. We have 1.2 billion people in this country. We have more than the gods in this country. So what are we doing to our own children through these processes? India is the largest arms purchasing country in the world, increasing military and weapons. For what? America, the largest seller of arms to the rest of the world, to teach democracy. So what are we doing to our children through this educational process?
I'll try to give a brief answer to that question. Thank you very much for the comment, for the question from the comment, by the way. Well, we probably have to distinguish between two different notions of human development, of the concept of human development. I think there's, on the one hand, more a political, a social notion, social version of that term of human development. And the second one is more, if you want, a psychological one. So human development focusing on the individual growing, individual development, and so on, the mechanisms, on the conditions of individual growth, individual growing. And now my question is, so I'm focusing on the second notion of human development, not on the third one. So this psychological version of human development has been developed by authors like Piaget or like Vygotsky, among others. Now, what I'm asking in this paper is, human development is a much too broad concept. When we are talking about education, we are talking about a particular form of human development. And this is, so is my claim, for example, this is the development of the ability to participate at public reasoning, at public discussions and rational public discussions. Now, the very interesting question is how we can relate this understanding of education as human development to the more social or political sense of human development in terms of having a society which does not exclude some groups of persons and so on. This is a question also about, not only about social, but also about educational justice, I think. And when we are talking about educational justice, we are dealing with an idea of an educational system which is capable to provide every single child with the capacity to take a part, to find her own voice, and to articulate her problems, her interests in the broad public space of that society. So I think that the problem of many societies is that there are a large number of persons who are not able to find their voices in order to be heard in the public realm. And this is a failure of education, of the educational system, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stojanov. I think at the very introduction, Professor Rohit Dhankar has mentioned that the very purpose of this international seminar for philosophy of education, where he has clearly mentioned that educational philosophy of education or education itself is to stand of its own foot. And you have clarified the position or try to raise the issue that concept of education and concept of pedagogy are to be clearly defined and distinguished.
Yeah.
My point is that why you have raised this issue, if I have understood it, some of the basic discipline or other academic discipline intervening to the education discipline itself, giving the name that interdisciplinary subject as education is, instead of helping education becoming as an academic discipline, rather it is harming the academic discipline like education if we consider education as an academic discipline. My question is that if we differentiate and distinguish these two, education in a broader perspective, concept analysis, normative analysis, and at the same time, pedagogical analysis of education. Do you like to differentiate these two brands, and can you build education as an academic discipline of its own self, or it is to be complementary to each other, building education itself as a discipline? What is your view regarding this? Thank you very much.
I think this is a very complex question. Well, my task in that paper was, that's true, was to make a distinction between education and pedagogical action, education and teaching. Why is that important? And this is the philosophical task, actually, philosophical in the narrow sense of the word. It is important precisely for answering the question which forms of pedagogy, which forms of pedagogical action to contribute to education, capable of promoting education, and which are not. This is the basic normative question, and this is, because this is a normative question, it is a genuine philosophical question. And this is, I think, if I understood you correctly, this is the question about the place of philosophy of education in the family of educational disciplines, of educational research. So, like I think David Carr, I would define the domain of philosophy as issues, as normative issues, issues about good education, about just education, pedagogical action, and so on. But your question goes further. The question is about the interdisciplinary framework of educational research. So I think that we should talk about education as a interdisciplinary field of research. There is no single science of education. And of course, another sciences like educational psychology, history of education could contribute to clarify the questions both of what is education about, questions of educational theory, and also the questions of pedagogical interactions. So to contribute to both educational and pedagogical questions. Okay?
Thank you. And I'm afraid we only have time really for one more question. It's going to come from right behind you, Krassimir.
In terms of the theory of Bildung itself, you have a number of theories coming up in a span of about 20 to 25 years. Now, what Hegel has to say itself appears in different texts in different ways. But one of the things that Hegel would probably insist on is the kind of Sittlichkeit to be made available, or should be there, and the Sittlichkeit and also the relation that he sees between the state of a certain kind. Now, in about 20 years later, you have Humboldt talking about a similar idea, where he is willing to talk about the limits of the state. So it's all, on the one hand, he is willing to say that, look, we can do away with much of the baggage that Hegel might have. Now, you have two different theories with coming from two different assumptions about the possibility of Bildung itself. How does one look at these two theories, and if they are competing theories, ideas of Bildung, what do each of these have in terms of implications? Thank you.
Well, a very brief answer would be to that question. At Humboldt, you don't have any account on Sittlichkeit. What does it mean? Sittlichkeit at Hegel is a notion of a collective life form, of an ethical life form, which is shared by a community. You don't have such idea at Humboldt. You have a very classical humanistic idea at Humboldt. According to him, Bildung is about the development of a single individual towards an ideal of the human race. So so the difference to Hegel, the crucial difference to Hegel is that Hegel tries to situate this question of human development within a shared life form, collective life form, with ethical implications also. This is the notion of Sittlichkeit. Now then, well, the second question was about the role of the state. So according to Humboldt, the state should step out, at least from the university, from the higher education. That is to say, the state should provide schools, and especially universities, with the resources, but should not try to evaluate or to govern schools and universities. I think Hegel has a different perspective to the role of the states, generally speaking. I think his perspective is that the proper state emerged from this collective form of Sittlichkeit, of shared ethical life forms. And I think that this is probably the most problematic part of the Hegelian philosophy altogether.
Thank you very much, Krassimir. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop there. We're going to move straight into hearing John White's paper. So thank you very much, Krassimir, again.